Marco Rubio has had a billionaire basically in his back pocket his entire political career. He portrays himself as a bootstraps, up from poverty. Dad was a bartender kind of story. Dad was a Cuban immigrant, and little Marco brought himself up by his bootstraps. And I have some familiarity with this. My dad was, for a while, the president of the Horatio Alger Society. Now, this was not people who believed in Horatio Alger's sales pitch, but rather book collectors. My dad was a book collector. He had 20,000 books in his basement. And he had first editions of virtually every Horatio Alger book when he died. And it was a bunch of mostly men who got together, once a year. And they most of them collected multiple books. Dad collected first editions of Rex Stout, the Nero Wolfe series of P.G. Wodehouse. But anyhow, the up from your bootstraps story that is told in those books, oddly enough, always involves a young man meeting, as in like a teenage young man, sometimes younger than teenage, meeting an older, wealthy man who takes this young man under his... This is the Horatio Alger story. You could read it, and it starts out with Dick the Bootblack, and you can read it in book after book after book. I've read these books. I grew up with them. And this older man takes this younger man under his arm and under his wing and helps make him successful and rich. It is, and we all talk about the Horatio Alger story, like, it's like, yeah. Well, that's literally what has happened to Marco Rubio. He was a relatively middle-class young man who found a billionaire who took him under his arm. Now, a few years before my dad died, it came out that Horatio Alger was also apparently a gay pedophile. He was a gay man who liked young boys. And when that story hit the news, my dad was still alive, and I talked to Dad, and I said, in the context of these Horatio Alger stories, does this make sense? And he was like, yeah, unfortunately. He did not want to believe it, but there it is. And I'm not suggesting that Marco Rubio and the billionaire who has funded him since he was a young man are getting it on or anything like that. And besides that, they would be consenting adults. But the point is that story was the story that Horatio Alger was writing during the last Gilded Age, right, in the 1920s. And that story of coming up, being brought up by your bootstraps, and so anyhow, Marco Rubio's had this billionaire from the beginning. And now he's got a couple more billionaires. It looks like Sheldon Adelson is going to give him money. And Paul Singer came out and said, yeah, here, I'm going to not only endorse you, but Paul Singer also wrote a letter to his fellow billionaires saying Marco Rubio's our guy. Paul Singer, the guy who's in the process of trying to take down the country of Argentina. You've heard Greg Palast go off about him at length. He's got a chapter about him in his book, what was it? Vultures and Ballot Buzzards or whatever. Anyhow, gregpalast.com. You can read the whole thing. Ballot Bandits and yeah. And I don't know if Paul Singer was a funder of the Swift boats, although I've read that in several places. I can't say that for a fact, but he has funded, interestingly, and this was a piece published over on Breitbart. Paul Singer, as Politico reported at the time, quote, Singer quietly got involved in the fight for immigration reform, making a six-figure donation to the National Immigration Reform, a George Soros-backed organization that lobbied for Rubio's legislation to issue 33 million green cards to foreign nationals in the span of a single decade. Now, Donald Trump has this to say about it. He says, lobbyists write the rules to benefit the rich and powerful. They buy off senators like Marco Rubio to get them rich at the expense, to help them get rich at the expense of working Americans by using H-1B visas, so-called high-tech visas, to replace American workers in all sorts of solid middle-class jobs. Senator Rubio works for the lobbyists, not for Americans. That is why he is receiving more money from Silicon Valley than any other candidate in this race. He is their puppet. End of quote from Donald Trump. Back to the story in Breitbart. by Julia. I can't read this last name. It's unfortunate. Breitbart had put her name in color, and when you print it out in black and white, it's just so faint you can't read it. Anyhow, she writes, according to Open Secrets, Goldman Sachs has been one of Rubio's biggest financial boosters. Interestingly, Goldman Sachs is among the top 50 corporate users of the H-1B visas, which labor experts call an indentured servitude program. Computer World's Patrick Thibodeau says Goldman Sachs is ranked number 33 among the biggest users of the H-1B program. Behind Goldman Sachs, Microsoft is the second largest contributor to Rubio's campaign committee since 2011. Similarly, Microsoft is the 12th biggest user of the H-1B program. Last year, Microsoft announced its plans to lay off 18,000 workers at the same time the company was lobbying to increase the H-1B program. Morgan Stanley has also been one of Rubio's top financial contributors. They rank 66th among biggest H-1B users. And it goes on.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
What we're seeing, and we're seeing it quite vividly in this Republican primary, is the power of corporate money to buy politicians who then buy legislation.